Welcome to part two of LBJ, the Great Society in Vietnam. Now we're going to talk about the Freedom Summer. As debate raged over the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, civil rights activists were pretty busy as well. They had planned, in order to try and drum up support for the act, to flood the South with activists and events and protests, including flooding Mississippi. Right. On June 22nd, 1964, three civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, Michael Henry Schwimmer, and James Earl Chaney, were down in Mississippi drumming up support for the Civil Rights Act when they went missing. They had been pulled over and arrested for speeding. They've been released after posting bond, and then that's the last anybody hears of them. On June 23rd, they find the burned out car that they were driving near Philadelphia, Mississippi, right? And then where are these three activists? Now, you're going to see a growing concern nationally over their whereabouts. And the wife of Andrew Goodman is actually going to be kind of a voice piece for this. She's going to be interviewed several times, and at one point she's going to make a statement saying, you know what, they wouldn't even be looking for these three men if my husband wasn't white. You know, she's basically saying if these were just African American activists, nobody would even be looking or caring about it. Is she right? Well, I think there's something to what she said, because they are going to have an increasingly concerted effort to find them that's even going to involve the FBI. And in the process of trying to find these men, they're going to find 7 bodies in the backcountry there of Mississippi of missing civil rights activists who were all African American, right, who had not been searched for up to this point. Finally, in Neshoba County on August 4th, 1964, the bodies of these three civil rights workers were found, right? Schwimmer and Goodman had both been shot once through the heart, and James Earl Chaney, the African-American, the injuries showed that he was probably beaten with a chain to the point where pretty much almost every bone in his body was broken, and then had been shot 3 times. On December 4th, 1964, 21 men will be arrested in connection to the killing of these 3 men, including the Neshoba sheriff, Lawrence Rainey, and the deputy, Cecil Price, who had initially pulled them over. Now, even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a great triumph, there's still a lot more work to be done. I mean, as I mentioned before, in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act, the voting rights of African Americans were still heavily suppressed. For example, in 5 Mississippi counties, there were no registered African Americans to vote, despite them having a 57% black population, right? This is going to lead Martin Luther King to leading a nonviolent march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The first attempt at this march, on March 7th, 1965, will only make it to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they'll be confronted by Alabama state troopers and Sheriff Clark of Dallas County, and they'll be attacked by his private army, these troopers, bullwhips, tear gas fired. They'll be hit with cattle prods, and some even had baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire. 80 demonstrators will be hospitalized. As I said before, this is going to result in LBJ pushing for a Voting Rights Act, which will be signed into law August 4th, 1965. It's going to drastically increase the number of blacks voting in the South and black office holders. Some other things of note: James Meredith, I mentioned before, who got his doctorate at the University of Mississippi, will march across Mississippi in 1966 to try and promote black voter registration. A man will step out of the bushes on June 6, 1966, and shoot him with a shotgun, right? The civil rights movement will become more militant, with activists like Stokely Carmichael, right? Who will be in direct odds with Martin Luther King Jr. Matter of fact, in the second march from Selma to Montgomery, the 2 men marched side by side and were interviewed, and both giving opposing views on how the march should go. Dr. King saying that it should remain nonviolent, and Stokely Carmichael saying, I don't see anybody asking white America to be nonviolent, right? On April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King will stand on the balcony of his hotel room when he will be assassinated himself. This is going to spark riots across the entire nation in the aftermath. Now, for now, we're going to leave the civil rights movement here, right? But we need to realize until the day comes when we don't have to make considerations like this, the ongoing civil rights movement is still a very active and a very real thing.